Time to delve further into the world of Weiss's nightmare in Ice Queendom Episode 5. Spoilers ahead if you have not seen the episode yet, as I will not be showing any of the episode or clips from it in this video, simply images of the episode and analyzing the events that take place. I will leave links in the description below so you guys can go to either Crunchyroll or Rooster Teeth first, watch the series there, and support this amazing show. Now, this episode starts off as RWBY's having a bit of a tough time in Weiss's dream. At the end of the last episode, we saw that Weiss and RWBY were confronting one another, and we learn here that it did not go well for RWBY. The doll hanging above her head seems to be now an indicator of how she's doing within the dream. And as a slash appears across the doll, it is signifying that RWBY has been injured within the dream. Weiss was able to swiftly defeat her, and so Shion immediately pulls RWBY out of the dream. Shion does this by manipulating the string, and words seem to be typed on a keyboard that appear on a monitor, spelling out the word wake, which the keyboard seems to be typing on its own. Again, Shion's abilities seem really encompassing a lot of different things, and RWBY is then awoken from the dream. Inside the dream, the version of RWBY disappears in a flurry of strings. Weiss thinks she just escaped, and thus tells Grumpy Klein to go and find her. But we also see a statue of Jacques that tells Weiss if she's truly a daughter of Schnee, that she will do her duties. And Weiss obviously doesn't really seem too happy by this, again, under her father's thumb. And she says that she will prove that she is worthy of being a Schnee, as we see the nightmare's vines appear in her shadow. The series itself is really seeming to imply that this is Weiss's greatest insecurity, that being worthy of the Schnee name is something deeply important to Weiss, which it absolutely is, but I also think that this might be a little bit of a red herring, that it's not her insecurities about kind of impressing Jacques or meeting Jacques' expectations. I don't think that's going to be her greatest insecurity, even though it is the most prominent in the world. I do think that actually winter is going to be the key to that. I made an entire video on that right up there, but obviously, Jacques is still having a profound effect on Weiss, both in the real world and represented very prominently within this dream. Meanwhile, in the real world, RWBY relays the information that she gained in Weiss's dream to the rest of her team and the professors that are present, including the map that she had been able to plot out in her journey to the center of Weiss's dream. Shion points out that the nightmare is likely in the center of Weiss's mind, the center of her world. And again, considering that Weiss is always carrying the book with her, I think that is the physical representation of the nightmare, taking the form of winter. But RWBY then goes on to say that Weiss really seems like she hates her, and Shion says that is just the nightmare trying to convince you of that. And that is the nightmare preying on the parts of Weiss that do actually hate the parts of RWBY, like the childish side, and because there is parts of Weiss that do hate parts of RWBY, like parts of her character, and to be fair, RWBY was the only one who actually said she hated Weiss earlier in the season, during the initiation, so I think RWBY's probably going to end up apologizing for that later on, and that might, help Weiss snap out of it. Apologizing for what she said, so then Weiss can kind of break free from the nightmare and realize that she truly doesn't hate RWBY, etc. RWBY also mentions that Weiss was incredibly strong within the dream, so much so that RWBY couldn't handle her at all. Something that I mentioned in the last episode, this being Weiss's dream world, she is as strong as she thinks she is, and Shion confirms that right then and there. But Shion mentions that their aura hasn't recovered yet, and so they're going to need to take some time until it does. Meanwhile, they need to decide who else they're going to send into the dream. All of Team RWBY volunteers this time. RWBY kind of says, I kind of maybe should do this by myself, but Yang and Blake shut that down real quick, because RWBY could not handle it last time. Weiss completely overpowered her, and also we saw how well she was handling her finances within the dream, which, is brought up a couple times throughout this episode. RWBY should not be the one handling the rest of her team's wallet. After they graduate and assuming the world gets set back on track, if they start taking missions and start earning money, RWBY should not be in charge of Team RWBY's finances. Just let's make that clear right now. She ain't good with money. And so they all decide to go in together. Blake also mentions that just like Weiss doesn't care about Blake's past, Blake has decided not to care about Weiss's. Though I think there's going to be a little bit more to that. It's going to be a little bit more difficult for Blake to say that she doesn't care. After seeing how the Faunus are represented within Weiss's nightmare, I would imagine, at least in my opinion, that would be very offensive to see, and there would be a lot of conversations that would need to happen after Weiss wakes up to get things more back on track. Regardless, she still wants to help Weiss and break her out of that nightmare. Before they can jump back in, though, Team Juniper actually shows up to kind of see how things are going. They don't really get a chance to do much, but John does actually say that he wishes that he could be possessed instead of Weiss to take her place, which does make Pyra a little bit sad. By this point, she does have feelings for Jean, and she wants Jean to kind of see her that way, but at this point in the RWBY series, as we know, continues until late into Volume 2, Jean is infatuated with Weiss and doesn't really have eyes for anyone else at this point in time. However, we don't have much time to dwell on this, as Glinda quickly sends all of Team Juniper away because they need to get to class. Of course, Team RWBY is an exception right now because they need to save their friend from the nightmare before she's consumed entirely. And once Shion's aura is recovered, all of Team RWBY dive into Weiss's nightmare. And now I want to pause for a moment to touch on Shion's abilities once again, because we are seeing just a little bit more with every episode. The fact that there is so many physical objects not only representing Shion's aura, but also incorporated into Shion's abilities, this is really a set of non-canon abilities. Certain portions of the abilities could be canon, for example, the dream walking or the ability to manipulate strings, but having all of these physical objects incorporated into it, like the hourglass that is completely separate from Shion's aura, yet represents how much aura Shion has left. The stand that the hourglass is on has characters that are constantly moving on it. The fact that there's a keyboard typing on its own, and a computer monitor and a telephone as well, like the physical objects and all of these things are definitely non-canon portions of abilities, and I understand why Ice Queendom is representing it this way, as a physical representation, making it easier for the audience to understand. However, for anyone designing OCs for the RWBY universe and everything, if you're trying to fit them into canon, Shion's abilities are not the example to follow. Portions, absolutely, but not the entire set of abilities, as that is pretty guaranteed to be non-canon at this point in time. But now, delving into Weiss's nightmare. Each of the members of Team RWBY appear in the same location that RWBY did, on the outskirts of Weiss's world. So, when we were told in the last episode that RWBY replaced the dream version of herself, the original version represented in Weiss's dream just completely disappeared from wherever it was, and RWBY replaced them on the outskirts of Weiss's nightmare. And this becomes relevant later in the episode, but for now, RWBY, Blake, and Yang are, discovering what each other looks like in this other world. Blake sees her reflection, that only one of her ears is covered. Surprisingly, she doesn't comment on the fact that she now has cat paws as well as, a tail and has more animalistic characteristics, but they do comment on each other's weapons, as RWBY says, look what happened to Crescent Rose, it's a snowboard now, and the gun is pointed in the wrong direction. She does kind of show Blake and Yang by pointing the barrel at them, but, she at least knows not to have her hand on the trigger at the time, and for Blake and Yang, their weapons seem to be pretty much the same. However, their abilities are actually exaggerated in Weiss's dream as well, showing that Weiss has a higher opinion of Blake and Yang's combat powers than she does of RWBY's. Because, RWBY was getting in her way quite a bit during the initiation. But Blake, when she throws out her Gamble Shroud, can apparently throw it for miles. So that's probably going to be pretty useful. With the ribbon being that long, with it having so many capabilities, she'll probably be able to ensnare quite a few enemies in her ribbon. And then Yang, when she goes to punch a tree, essentially causes an explosion, so her punches get a lot stronger in this dream as well. This is going to create some pretty high caliber fights later on in the series, and I am really looking forward to seeing how things will unfold. As they progress further into the dream, they once again stumble across the sign that is, in my mind, a representation of Weiss's confusion. That this sign is present in the outskirts of Weiss's dream world represents how confused she is in the outside world, outside of what she already knows. Again, made a video on that if you guys wanted to check that out. Yang pretty much says the exact same thing that RWBY did, that, wow, there's so many things on here, I can't make any sense of it. Just like Weiss. You know, the outward aspect that, from their perspective, they can never truly discern what Weiss is saying, what her intentions are, but this is a representation of how Weiss feels on the inside, something that they have not clued into yet. And then all three of them see the train once again, and the situation plays out exactly as it had before. The dream seems to be almost on repeat. Likely every time they would leave the dream and come back, the dream starts over. In this case, the train comes across the tracks again, and the Faunus, the White Fang, attack just as they had before in the exact same way, and end up taking it down. Again, they kind of want to interfere, but RWBY mentions that Shion had told them not to. Then they go to the marker that RWBY had set before, and they find out that the marker is still there, but the map on RWBY's scroll, the map that she had taken pictures of, has disappeared. So, it is determined that only the things created by Shion's aura are maintained, which makes sense. However, you'd think Shion would have to constantly expend aura for the constructs created from their aura to still be present within the dream. Unless, of course, you want to say that since this is kind of part of Weiss's imagination, that it is just now a part of the dream, and it's kind of a form of hypnosis almost, that Shion's aura has now had kind of a hypnotic effect on Weiss in her dream, and this is now just part of that world, or something of the like. Regardless, they are able to get into the city, and Blake immediately recognizes the statue of Jacques Schnee, the leader of the Schnee Dust Company, and, well, kind of as the tyrant that he is, the one that the White Fang is in opposition to, and his, you know, completely fair and legal business practices. They see the wall that RWBY had mentioned before that she could not get past, and so they decide to split up to find a way through. But before we see where each of their journeys led, we cut back to Weiss as she is inside the Schnee Manor, or her inner sanctum, the center of her dream. And things play out pretty much exactly the same here. That she gets a report from the Klein on the table, the Flame, who I'm now thinking is the dwarf named Doc, kind of the leader, more sensible of the dwarves, and I think that this is the Klein that is represented here. And so Doc gives the report of the train being attacked by the Faunus. Weiss asks again when they will be able to receive more trains into the city, and questions about the girl clad in black, that she is still out there. But what's different is now Weiss asks about RWBY and Yang specifically, and Klein reports that neither of them have been spotted by Master Jacques anywhere in the city. They've been able to avoid Jacques' eyes, whereas previously RWBY had been spotted by all of the Jacques everywhere around, and now we see how things are playing out differently. But it is mentioned that since they haven't been seen in the outside, that they must still be locked away in their tower where they're supposed to be. And Weiss mentions that maybe soon we will be able to find our true peace, meaning that the Faunus would stop attacking and she'd be able to run the kingdom the way she wants to. We're not exactly sure what her true peace would be inside this dream, but then she offers up a prayer for the time destined to come, meaning that there is some time, some event that they are anticipating to happen within the dream. And then a coffin slides out from the wall. It is made of glass with an apple emblazoned on it, of course representing the poisoned apple from the fairy tale of Snow White, where she is put to rest and could only be awakened by true love's kiss. A little bit of a spoiler for later in the episode, but I'm pretty sure White Rose shippers are gonna have a field day with this one, as resting inside of the coffin is the White Knight chess piece, resembling the relic that Team RWBY got from the Beacon initiation. And this one is colored white to represent Weiss's heart, how it is trapped within this coffin. At least that's how I interpret it. And then we see where RWBY, Blake, and Yang ended up as they journeyed throughout the city. Yang ended up at a shop that has another bunch of road signs and is really just confusing to her. Again, probably a representation of Weiss's confusion, even within her own world. But Blake, on the other hand, finds something very useful. She sees a shadow climb up onto a frozen fountain and walk through the ice, seemingly a gateway to somewhere. But the most interesting of all is RWBY. Now that she's in kind of a more central part of the city, she still finds and stumbles across another version of Dopey Klein. So it seems like there are Dopey Kleins in multiple areas of the city because, well, sillies are everywhere. There's some over there and some over there. And so, of course, RWBY asks, well, if you can connect from one place to another, do you think you can connect to, like, the central area? Which, of course, he responds with, of course not. Why would there ever be sillies right where the Schnee family is? What a stupid question. Which, you know, makes sense. It would be a little too easy to get there, but in this silly's jail is someone very important. Walking out into the center of the cell is Pyra. She seems very elegant and almost ethereal, like there is a white glow around her, and she starts to sing. The song she sings is incredibly impactful. She sings Mirror, Mirror, the song that we heard in the original White trailer, the song that represents Weiss's loneliness. And it is Pyra who is singing this. Dopey Klein refers to her as just someone who sings to the town. But this scene is so impactful, so emotional, and it holds a lot of meaning as well. The fact that Pyra is wearing a dress very similar to Weiss's back in volumes 4 and 5 is a representation of Weiss's loneliness. I think how Weiss kind of views herself in Pyra, that she can see Pyra as someone who's alone as well, that maybe both of them can be a solution to each other's loneliness. And maybe I'm reading too far into this, but the fact that this representation of Pyra is present in Weiss's dream, it is almost a call for help for Weiss, that she is singing across the city, that she is the loneliest of all, that she is hoping someone can come save her. Behind Pyra appear the rest of Team Juniper as well, and RWBY is kind of just in awe of Pyra's singing, but she gets a call from Yang saying that they all need to meet up because, you know, Blake found something. So she waves goodbye to the rest of Team Juniper, and Jean, Nora, and Ren wave back to her silently. In this cell, it seems like Jean, Ren, and Nora are present there, but Pyra, as I mentioned, kind of has this aura around her that makes me think she's not actually imprisoned in the Silly's jail, because that doesn't really make sense given how highly Weiss thinks of her. Though, if Jacques does have all of this control over Weiss's world, then even in Weiss's mind, she would think that Jacques would want her imprisoned for being a commoner, for not being someone on the level of the Schnee family, regardless of how Weiss views her. And again, calling back to episode 4, I think Pyra might have been the person that Weiss decided to escape to go see and talk to, because she feels a kinship with Pyra, though it could have very likely been RWBY as well, given what we see later on in the episode. Also, just want to point out that Ren's wearing a cool hat in this scene. Something else to differentiate his design from his original one, but not exactly practical in battle. Still, representation of kind of the, I guess, culture that his character is meant to be from as well. Nice little touch to add in there. But now we see all of Team RWBY as they've gathered around this fountain, but there are guards there as well. RWBY goes straight for the coins to try to make a decoy to, well, draw the guards away and be able to get there. But Yang shuts that down real quick. This is actually the second time that RWBY had just jumped to trying to use the coins. Immediately upon arriving in the dream for the second time, RWBY had wanted to use one of the coins for some purpose, I guess maybe to call Shion or something, but she's just real eager to spend those coins. And at the beginning, they had decided to count how many coins they had, just to see what resources they had available. Each of them had been given 4 coins. And another thing to note in this scene as well, Blake actually has paw pads on the palms of her hands. Something that I didn't think was going to be present, but something that's a cute little touch to add on to Blake's design as well. But at the fountain, they don't actually need to use a coin to distract the guards, because Blake's there, and her semblance is meant to create clones on its own, so she does so. However, her semblance here works differently than it does in the original RWBY series, because she creates a clone, and the clone actually moves. In the original RWBY series, her semblance of shadow only creates stationary clones to take the hit for her. They aren't actually mobile, but here they are. And when the guards walk up, the clone disappears and they're able to get through to the centralmost ring of the city, a place where RWBY had previously not been able to get to. So they use their first coin for this journey, so they still have 11 left after this as they make another checkpoint, leave another marker so that they can travel back and forth from there. Definitely using their resources a lot more efficiently than RWBY did in her first venture into the dream, because she was using those coins like they were going out of style, making decoys, making maps, etc. They don't really need to make maps at this point, so, you know, RWBY for reconnaissance, that made sense, though I think she did use a few too many decoys and was using them a bit too frequently to call Shion for outside assistance. However, makes sense, but now they're using them a lot better. Unfortunately, though, Whitley sees that the guards are a bit distracted, and he asks why. Finds out that there's another intruder and immediately goes to report this to Weiss. But before doing so, we see Klein refer to that coffin as a beautiful resting place for true sleep. True sleep, probably referencing, you know, death, but besides that point, he says that only daughters of the Schnee name may enter. And again, reaffirming for Weiss to say that she will prove herself as a daughter of the Schnee family, as Whitley comes in and tells her that there's trouble, that there's more intruders, and she now wants to prove herself once again. Now back with the rest of Team RWBY as they have their first look at the central portion of the city, they see the giant statue of Jacques at the center, this being the tower that was mentioned earlier, and Blake is the only one to recognize that this symbolizes the massive impact that Jacques has had on Weiss's life. Both RWBY and Yang think that's, you know, pretty smart of Blake to discern that. However, they see that megaphones start popping up from glyphs around the city, and an announcement goes out that RWBY and Yang have escaped their imprisonment from the tower, and they need to be captured or else something bad will happen. So RWBY realizes that, well, they want to get to the tower, and these guards and everyone wants to put us back in the tower, so why don't we just play along with it? So RWBY and Yang then surrender. It's also noted that Blake wasn't mentioned in this announcement, and that starts to lead Blake to think that, well, maybe she's just not represented in the dream. And, you know, from what I mentioned earlier in this review, I think Blake is going to have some other discussions that she needs to have with Weiss as she finds out how exactly she's represented in the dream. Blake is represented as the villain, probably the leader of the White Fang, or a Faunus that is breaking the laws of Weiss's empire. But that'll probably be touched on in the next episode. As RWBY and Yang are captured, they are taken up the tower, a huge spiral staircase, and then we meet the guard of their cell. Another Klein transformed into a door. However, this one is Sleepy Klein. So we've now met the sixth of the Kleins. We have Sleepy, Grumpy, Dopey, and Happy. So for sure, we know 4 of the Kleins and what dwarf they are meant to represent. That leaves 3 other dwarves left: Bashful, Sneezy, and Doc. So, as a lot of people are theorizing, I'm starting to think that the Klein represented by the flame is Doc. Very sensible, more of a leader type, and the one that Weiss seems to be relying on. So I think the flame is meant to represent Doc, and that leaves the Dog Klein, and one other Klein that we have yet to meet. So the Dog Klein is either Bashful or Sneezy. Now, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say, when we meet Sneezy, which really isn't an emotion, it's just an act of sneezing, or in the process of sneezing, so I feel like we're going to know that Klein the moment that we see them, because they're going to be in the middle of a sneeze or in the process of sneezing, etc. So I guess that makes the Dog Bashful Klein? I guess loyal, following everything that Weiss commands. Maybe that makes sense. Let me know in the comments if you guys make sense of that, because it seems a little odd that the Bashful one is represented by the dog, but, you know, Still, all of the Kleins seem to be represented in this dream. However, Sleepy Klein is of course asleep, which makes it very easy for people to sneak past him. Grumpy Klein wakes him up, calls him an idiot, and says, look, your prisoners are outside of the cell. What do you think you're doing? So of course, they throw RWBY and Yang back into Sleepy Klein's cell, and inside this room, they notice that they're surrounded by all of Weiss's favorite things. It's a very nice room, representative of their room at Beacon Academy, including the bunk beds. And when RWBY peers into her own bed, we see the sign, the same sign that was represented in the outskirts of Weiss's dream world, the one that I think represents her confusion in the outside world. And this is lying in RWBY's bed. Weiss is confused about how she feels about RWBY. And lying on top of that is the other half of the relic, a red knight piece, kind of symbolizing that RWBY is Weiss's other half. RWBY does recognize this as one of the relics that they got from the Beacon Academy initiation, and theorizes that there must be another one out there to make the matching pair. RWBY has the red knight, Weiss has the white knight. Weiss is confused about how she feels about RWBY specifically. That sign is only present in her head. You know how I mentioned White Rose shippers are probably going to have a field day with this one? Well, this could easily be interpreted that Weiss is very conflicted about her feelings about RWBY, that she sees her as kind of her other half, a better half, or what, however you want to interpret that. It really does imply that Weiss has some very strong and yet confusing feelings for her towards RWBY. Now, of course, that's likely meant to represent how she feels about her being a leader, how she feels about her being a friend, how she feels about her maybe not being as skilled as her, being younger than herself, etc. But there's easily romantic interpretation there as well. RWBY then calls Shion to try to get their opinion on how things are unfolding. And Shion is, well, asleep when RWBY's phone call comes through. So, you know, it's not always difficult being a nightmare hunter. You can just take a nap while other people are in the dream, and using your semblance, even using your aura, apparently Shion can just take a nap and doesn't have to stay focused on it all the time. So, you know, being a nightmare hunter isn't all bad overall. Still, Shion is able to hear the phone ring, picks it up, talks to RWBY, and tells RWBY that, okay, that knight, that relic that she has, is probably a representation of Weiss trying to fight back against the nightmare, and will likely be the key to opening her mind, to unlocking her heart. Not to mention, with that coffin represented with the apple symbol on it, the poisoned apple that puts Snow White to sleep, that can only be awoken by true love's kiss, RWBY having the other knight, whereas the original knight is present within this coffin. Like, they're really pushing the White Rose shipping in this episode. I'm not really complaining, to be honest. They would make a very cute couple, but still, I don't know if that's really the overall intention here, or just more focusing on the connection between RWBY and Weiss. Still, amazing symbolism and imagery present throughout this entire dream, throughout this entire series, really. But RWBY then is going to use another of her coins to call Blake to the room, to create a passage and just get her there. But again, Yang stops her, saying, look, we don't want to waste the coins, we want to conserve them, and pretty much immediately afterwards, the lock to Sleepy Klein is picked, Blake enters the room, and breaks them all out. Sleepy Klein doesn't wake up at all during this, and Blake just, you know, has the ability to pick locks. A real cat burglar of sorts. You know, I kind of get the references that they're going for here. But RWBY points out that maybe one of them should stay behind just so that alarms aren't raised. And after a quick rock, paper, scissors, Yang ends up losing, so she stays behind. So when Sleepy Klein wakes up, she can just say, yep, we're both here, go back to sleep, and Sleepy Klein obeys. But Blake and RWBY venture off on their own. Happy to see both of those two interacting more in this series. And as they are journeying through what is very obviously the Schnee Manor, we see the Grand Hall that we saw in Volume 7, except instead of it just being two Armagiga statues that are there, the helmets are removed and we see the face of Nicholas Schnee, as he is represented here Again, symbolic of how much Weiss admires her grandfather. While Blake was journeying around and trying to find out where Ruby and Yang were taken, she did find a passage that leads underground, likely deeper into the core of the nightmare. So both Ruby and Blake decide to journey there. But this is when Ruby mentions that the relics are likely in a pair, just as they were during the beacon initiation, that there was one with her, and she poses the idea that there was likely one with Blake wherever her alter ego ended up. And now, that may be the case, that there is a third relic wherever Blake was, but I honestly kind of doubt that, because relics always came in a pair of two. Ruby had one, and we already know that one is locked within this coffin. So I think there's just going to be those two, because if there was one for each member of Team Ruby, there would have been another one in the cell where Yang and Ruby were supposed to be imprisoned together. But we'll see how that develops later on to see how Blake reacts to not having that great of a representation in Weiss's inner world. Regardless, though, Blake and Ruby then venture further into this underground, I guess, chamber of sorts. As they enter this room, it's full of pillars and massive chairs. I really got a sense of the Mines of Moria from Lord of the Rings, but, you know, we'll see what this room actually ends up being. They do comment that they probably won't be able to just make their way through. Not exactly sure what was meant by that, but it is a very long room that seems to stretch on forever as they keep walking. There's just more pillars, more chairs, until, of course, they stumble upon the Ice Queen herself, along with all of her soldiers. Grumpy Klein is there, along with a few guards. Whitley is there, as well as the bashful dog, Klein. So, yeah, they're in for a fight next episode, and we do know that a fight is actually going to happen, as we were kind of shown that in the little Ice Queendom preview that was giving us a glimpse as to what is going to happen from episode 4 onwards. There's very likely going to be a battle that takes place here. Overall, another wonderful episode to set up the events to come in Ice Queendom. We got to see a little bit more of Weiss's dream world, the first introduction to the dream versions of Blake, Yang, and especially Pyra, to see how Pyra is represented in almost an ethereal, elegant way. The singing of Mirror, Mirror. I know a lot of people in the early episodes of Ice Queendom really wanted to see the original soundtrack of RWBY represented here. And honestly, I kind of did too, because the music is very representative of the characters. But they are using some of the original soundtrack, it seems, and they are using it in a very impactful way. When Pyra sings Mirror, Mirror, the lyrics along with it, which, by the way, even in the subbed version of Ice Queendom, the song was sung in English. So I'm curious to see how it's going to be dubbed, if the voice actress of Pyra is going to be singing, or if they're going to use the original dubbing that was shown in the current version of Ice Queendom. Regardless, it was beautifully done, the animation along with it, how it was showing Weiss looking at the version of herself, the version that she saw in the mirror, that she wants to hide from. Like, they used this song perfectly to represent how Weiss is feeling about herself, how she's afraid of herself, afraid of this version of herself, afraid of what she might become under Jacques' thumb. Like, there are so many possibilities that are represented by just this one scene, and Ice Queendom is doing a fantastic job of just giving us so much in terms of character development for Weiss, how she truly feels on the inside, and how everything is represented. One last thing I do want to mention. At the end of this episode, when Ruby and Blake find Weiss does say one thing to them. I've already told you, there is no room for Faunus. Whenever we've seen the reports that Klein has been giving Weiss in last episode and this episode, Klein happily reported that there are no Faunus present in her kingdom whatsoever. Which tells me that the representation of the White Fang is how all Faunus are represented within Weiss's dream. The fact that Blake is differentiated from the Faunus that appear as Grimm is because Weiss has talked with Blake, has seen her face. There is a face she can apply to the monster. She sees Blake as an in-between, between these beastly Faunus and the people that she regularly knows. This is something that is going to absolutely be delved into further. I think there is going to be some trials and tribulation for Blake coming to terms with how Weiss has been raised to feel about the Faunus, because in my last review, I was very harsh on Weiss, saying that she is a terrible person, which is absolutely true. At this point in the RWBY series, her views on Faunus and her views on other people, Team Juniper, and people that she feels are lesser than herself, she does have some horrible outlooks that do make her a terrible person. There is a reason for this, of course. She was raised by Jacques and had his views of the world implanted in her. She is really ignorant to the outside world around her. Doesn't change the fact that she's a terrible person, just means that there's a reason why she became that way. And this is also why Weiss has become such an endearing character throughout the RWBY series as a whole. Because we've seen how she's grown, how she's changed, and how she truly is when she can strike out on her own. This series, although it isn't doing any favors for Volume 1 Weiss, to be fair, we always knew she was a horrible person, it's just made much more clear to us now, is just adding so much more character to Weiss, and in my opinion, making her such a better character, giving us these views into how she used to see the world, making it so much more impactful how she's changed throughout the rest of the RWBY series. And hopefully everyone else will see that as well. There's still 7 more episodes of Ice Queendom left. We aren't even halfway done, and I'm really excited to see where it's going to go. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. How did you enjoy this episode, the events that played out? This episode did seem a little bit more like a setup episode for future events, getting, the rest of Team RWBY established within Weiss's nightmare, exploring a little bit, and now things are set to take motion. We will find out what this destined time is that Weiss was talking about, how she can truly make herself worthy of the name of Schnee, and we'll see how the relics play a role, how White Rose is going to be the key to breaking Weiss out of this nightmare. But overall, I look forward to hearing from you guys down below. If you guys enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, more coverage of Ice Queendom, more coverage of RWBY in general, make sure to subscribe and join the Guild of the Eternal Flame. Tweet me at PhoenixKnight7, and I'll see you guys in the next video.